The ethnography I am presenting on is written by Elizabeth D. Jacobs, and she wrote on the Nehalem Tillamook people of Oregon. Elizabeth Jacobs was married to Melville Jacobs, who was an American anthropologist known for his field work on linguistics of the Pacific Northwest people. He worked alongside Franz Boas, who requested that Melville study the linguistics of the Nehalem Tillamook. Elizabeth Jacobs went with him for the research study, and she conducted her own field work, but with no training as an anthropologist, she often did not record things that anthropologists of that time would record, such as place names, ethnobiographies, and material cultures. The following information that she recorded in her ethnography was based off of her observations and interviews conducted with many people of the area, including Clara Pearson, who has a lot of information that she shares. The tribal region of the Nehalem is right here in yellow. The Nehalem, Tillamook, Nestucca, and Siletz is all their territory divided by the dotted lines. It's about 100 miles long. Directly north of them in the green is the Chinook Nation, which follow the north and south sides of the Columbia River. The divisions among the Tillamook is divisions of dialects of the Salish language, which is what they spoke. And at the time of the ethnography in 1933, Tillamook villages were primarily located along Tillamook Bay, which you can see here. There's quite a few of them right there. On average, they were about 8 miles apart. They were permanent residences that were always located near water. The houses were spaced on average 5 to 6 yards apart from one another, and each village would have one menstrual women's work hut at the edge of the village. They would travel by water, rarely by foot, just due to the amount of streams and rivers, estuaries, and bays that were in their area. Prior to contact of Euro-American settlers, villages would have up to 25 houses per village with about 4 families in each house. So larger villages would support up to about 200 people. Their houses were built out of cedar planks that would not be held together with nails or wedges or anything like that. They were burned to seal moisture out and then scraped the charred parts off until they were smooth. Families that would live in the houses together were generally related and separated by mats that would hang from the ceiling as walls and partitions. They were very long in shape and rectangular, with 2 circular entrances, one in the front and one in the back. They'd be about 40 by 15 feet in dimension on average, and dug about 4 to 5 feet into the ground that would help insulate heat in the cold months. In the hot months, the roof was able to be removed as to let sunlight and wind and breezes into the building. The interiors were generally outlined in the edges with the beds, and the hearths and fireplaces would be in the middle. Provisions for these families would often be kept in a separate house that was made of grasses. These belonged to the women. They had the same layout as the dwelling structures, and both the dwelling structures, they could just last for hundreds of years because they would replace planks as they need them. Instead of rebuilding a whole house, they would just replace one rotting piece of wood. For their transportation, like I had mentioned, they used waterways, so they would travel in canoes. War canoes, which would be much larger. They'd be decorated extravagantly with paint and carvings into them. They would be able to visit relatives, families, and other villages across the bays by bringing gifts and food with them. This was their primary mode of travel. They wouldn't use horses, which even after introduction of horses, they wouldn't use them as much because those were used more in the plains and the plateau regions, such as the Palouse. And foot trails, they did exist, but they weren't quite as preferred form of travel. And for these canoes, one canoe would be made out of one whole trunk, and it wouldn't be multiple pieces assembled, but they would go upstream quite a ways to fell these logs, and they would let them float downstream until they got to the village to be carved out. For hunting and fishing, they hunted a lot of elk, beavers, seals, sea lions, and deer, primarily with bows and arrows, which were used on the land animals more. They used spears for seals and sea lions if they were hunting in the water. On the right, you can see a fish trap, which would direct all the fish or a lot of fish into that passageway, and they get trapped and they could get speared and caught that way. One thing that they highly valued was hygiene, especially in the hunting. So if a hunter did not catch anything, he would be told to go take a bath, because it would imply that his bodily uncleanliness was the cause of his failure, because the animals smelled the hunter and would have gotten away. Large hunting parties would be accompanied by women who didn't normally accompany on those hunting trips, and they would tend to camp, and they would have to sleep away from their husbands, because if they slept with them, the animals would smell them on them as well, and that would be another form of bodily uncleanliness. Any food that was caught on these hunting trips was processed that same day and where they got it. That way they would waste as little as possible. For material culture, they had tons. They had obviously clothing, body decorations. For clothing, Tillamook men would wear buckskin shirts and loose pants. Women often wore leggings with grass cedar bark skirts and shirts made of cedar bark or a skin cape. Shoes were not usually worn, and that's more of a Pacific Northwest thing. That's not just a Tillamook culture thing. But they would make moccasins if they were going on hunting trips or doing activities which would involve walking on rough surfaces. For body decorations, they would take very good care of their hair. They would wear, they would tattoo themselves, and they have in a striped pattern. But they would do face painting. That was also not just cultural art, but it would also protect them from the harsh weather of the coast. For natural medicines and hygienes, they had many natural remedies that they had, which ranged from little things just like aching joints or even bad breath to burns and sore throats and boils and just things like that. Other things they had for art, they had woven tri-colored baskets. They would have soap-sewn pipes. Trading networks were vast down the Columbia. That was prominent in their culture. Socially, they had a two-class system. They had free people and slaves. And many tribes along the Pacific Northwest coast followed that social order of nobles to commoners, lower class who were previous slaves, and then slaves. And slaves were highly valued for their sale price in the Columbia River Chinook villages. So Tillamook people would often travel south beyond the borders of their people who spoke the same language, and then they would bring back women and children and sell them, or nobles would have them. War expeditions were mainly for slave raiding, and they would travel pretty far for that. Dispute settlements were not really any political thing. They would generally be forgiven and discussed and disputed among the entire village between the two people who were disputing. Marriages were strongly pressured among youth, and in some cases arranged, like in wealthier families, but generally individuals did have the freedom to choose, and a man must be 18 to 20 years old who's able to hunt before he's allowed to marry. And the only instances of women exchanging sexual favors for valuables or money are those who are post-menopause, because they don't have any fear of pregnancy, because it was disgraceful to have a child with no father that would be held responsible. Their culture centered greatly around a complex system of supernaturalism, and they had powers said to return and reside in everyone, but particularly in the shaman. Wild Woman was a supernatural figure that was said to drive pretty girls insane and help male doctors. They did mark the time. They marked the length of a year based on the winter solstice, and that was their marker for their time. A lot of their folklore was based on 3 different methods: to teach, to entertain, and to warn. So creation stories, history, funny stories or scary ones, and warning, the cautionary tales for children and such. Expressively, they had music and songs that would cover things just for fun, for work, and for war, for post-fighting and pre-fighting, ceremonial chants, and gambling songs when they're playing games. Dreams were very important and considered very meaningful, so they were functioning as warnings. So if someone had a dream and they woke up from it, they were expected to go wake someone else up and tell them about it. That way they could just discuss it. Games were very seasonal, so they could only play certain games certain times of the year, which I think may have been implying that they could only play certain games with certain resources that were available in that time. As far as their etiquette, they had a few things that were just socially acceptable, where like they would have 3 meals a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and sometimes they'd have a snack between noon and eating later in the day for dinner. Families usually all ate together, and if a visitor happened to arrive, they were to be fed right away, no matter what time it was. If it was super early in the morning or between meals, they were supposed to be fed right then and there. Elders were also to be highly respected for their knowledge and experience in life. Children were warned not to make fun of them, or else they could have bad things happen to them because of the power that elders had. And as far as the entire community goes, food was always shared, and nobody ever had to beg for food, which even if certain families had certain amounts of food that they hunted or gathered, it was still kind of communal, where they would take care of one another. And in a theoretical perspective of Elizabeth Jacobs, she wasn't a traditional anthropologist because she didn't use traditional methods. She recorded data differently, and instead of just her observations, she would ask people to tell their story how they wanted to be told, which was different. Like, they would talk about what was important to them instead of what anthropologists in Western culture was interested in at the time, which was really important because their culture was very finely detailed due to her unconventional methods of recording it, and not as much of their cultural history or art or methods and patterns of the seasons. Not as much of that was lost after the diseases just wiped out a lot of their culture. And I was looking at Max Luckman for a different theorist because of the concept of how all social problems have their roots in colonialism. Because in Rights of Reversal, there was people acting outside the social roles which they normally would act. How in those situations where you can't really move up or down the social ladder, once populations declined and it was kind of all turbulent, some people who were generally commoners would try to become a noble classes by obtaining more wealth like that. Due to the sharp decline in populations, material culture, and languages, has their roots in colonialism. And then that is it. Works out page. And thank you.